So before we actually jump into the workshop and start making our chef knife, I want to cover a few sort of theory covered topics. For one, we're going to start off with how to design a chef knife. What goes into a chef knife? The important aspects and components that make up a chef knife. From there, we're going to start talking about abrasives. I think this is a very critically important aspect that a lot of knife makers don't put enough thought into, especially when you're looking at the processes you're working with, is your abrasive selection. From the abrasive selection, we're going to go into a workshop tour. So I'm actually going to take you through my workshop, go through all the machines I use, the different configurations and how we operate them. And then from there, I'm actually going to be doing a talk on body positioning and how to actually approach your work. Standing up straight, shoulders back. Knife making can be an extremely fatiguing hobby. So hopefully with these few tips and tricks that I'm going to go through in this theory, it'll put you in good stead to start making your knife. So in this section of the online course, we're actually going to be going through the theory on how to design a chef knife. There are hundreds of different types of chef knife designs, so we're just going to be covering the main basic workhorse chef knife, which is your general Western style 8-inch chef knife. So we're going to be going through all the different aspects, how to design them and how to get the right proportions for your design. When it comes to designing a chef knife, there's a few important aspects that you really need to understand to get these to look right and to perform right. So main thing I'm going to cover first is size, dimensions and how people actually categorize chef knives. So we're going to be doing a 8-inch chef knife or a 210mm or a 200mm chef knife. Different people call them different things, but that is your standard chef knife. So what I like to do is actually start off with a rectangle. So I've got my first rectangles here, which is going to be my actual blade length. So this one is roughly 210mm. I've got this section cut off here, that's where my handle is going to start, and then I have my handle back here. When it comes to chef knife handles, I've tried different things over the years. I've tried shorter handles, I've tried longer handles. What I found is that even though most people will tell you that you're going to hold a chef knife in the pinch position, not everybody does that. Some people are going to hold it back here, some people are going to use their finger on the top. I've seen some people do that if you're going to be chopping something. So you actually need to bear in mind that your handle is going to be used in a various amounts of grips. So I find the most ideal handle length for me is about 130 mils to about 145 on the really sort of bigger knives, just to give the balance point out. So I know most guys with hunting knives, you're looking at 120 mils, but you've got to bear in mind with chef knives, rather make your handles just a smidge longer. Doesn't have to be huge, but just give them a little bit more length, just so you have more variety when you actually want to hold it. It gives you more options. So we've got our blade section measured out, we've got our handle section measured out. All right. So from there, we're going to take our blade and put it on there. What I've also done is I've marked a center line here. The reason I've marked a center line is this actually gives you the classification of the chef knife you're using. All right. What you'll find if you look at a German style chef knife, this tip, okay, so we can see where the tip is over here. It is sitting above the midpoint. Most German chef knives will have a tip that is above the center line. What that generally does is give you a bit more belly to help with the rock chop. You'll find French chef knives will be generally on center right there, so we'll actually have that blade sitting on the center there, and it runs out like that. Those are your general Sabatier style chef knives. Then when you start looking at your Eastern style chef knives or your Japanese style chef knives, you'll find that tip will actually sit below your center line. Okay. Generally those blades will have a little bit less belly and they'll have more of a flat section for your slicing and chopping actions. Me personally, I like a tip just slightly above that center line. So what we're going to do is actually trace out this knife now. And we'll just do another one down here just so we can fiddle around and go through things. All right. Other important aspects to look for when you're looking at a chef knife. There's certain points that I like to know are right. So first things first, I want to know where my tip position is going to be, what style of tip I'm looking for. Am I going to go for German? Am I going to go for French? Or am I going to go for Japanese? Okay. Once we figured that out, generally what we're going to do is we want a bit of a flat section at the base of this heel. Okay. And I see a lot of guys, what they'll generally do is when they start designing, they'll actually take this and use a 90-degree there. Okay. It tends to make the knife a little bit more blocky. What I actually prefer, even though it's a flat section, it's slightly angled up. So it's actually going up at a bit of an angle like that. What that does is once I put the blade down like that, it actually kicks my handle up. So it gives me more clearance. Because the other important aspect is when you're looking at this section over here of your chef knife, is that when you're holding it, you want to make sure you're not banging your knuckles on the bottom of the cutting board. Okay, so you want to make good clearance there. When it comes to this height here by the heel, I usually go between 48 millimeters and 55 millimeters, all the way up to 60 millimeters, 2 inches, depending on the knife design and the actual blade length. But you want to make sure you've got enough space there. The height there also just is not the only deciding factor about knuckle clearance. You've got to remember that you've got this section here. So if your handle goes up higher here, and your hands tucked more higher up, you don't actually need that exact width there. So you just need to play with it, but bear in mind, always make a template and make sure that you have got good knuckle clearance for when you're doing your chopping actions. So we've covered our tip. So when I design my knives, I believe there's 2 ways to design a knife. There's the difficult way, so you're going to make your life difficult when you design a knife, or you design the knife around the materials and the processes that you use. So what I do is I know what machines I have in my workshop. I know what they are capable of. I design a knife around my machines. That way I'm not trying to fight things or do things at awkward angles, or I'm trying to remove material a lot of the time by hand. I can do most of my work on the machine. So I'll always design my knives around the machines I have. So we've got tip. We're going to look at this section here. So generally I'll do a 26 mil radius on this section over here. We'll do it over here. My knives will always have roughly 26 mil radius in that section there because my mini wheel is that size. And then I know I can use the same mini wheel to clean up that section there. That way I'm not fighting. I can get good clean machine finishes and everything can get squared away to make my finishing job easier. The other thing that I find that is really nice for design and makes it pop correctly is you've got to have a termination point on the handle. So I'll always bring my handles down to a point like that over there. What happens is some guys, they end up doing these weird rounded handles like that, where it doesn't end on a nice sharp point. And I just find it messes with the flow of the knife. So I always find it's really nice if you're going to be looking at your handles, what you want to do is you just make sure that you have a nice transition that terminates at a point. Even if you're going to be doing a wah style handle, so for example, we'll just design our own knife quickly. So we've got a blade shape. We're going to take that up there. And then we sort of got an hexagonal handle. But you want that transition to be sharp. You don't want too much of a round. What you can do here, though, is you can add a radius, but you want to make sure that it terminates on a nice sharp point. You want that transition point to be sharp at the end. This section here, so this is also your option. So I do a 25 mil because my mini wheels work with a 25 mil. But you can also do slightly smaller radiuses, which will be that transition over there. Then if we want, we can add a bit of a palm sole to make it a little bit more comfortable. And we can end it off like that. So these are the important aspects to look at a kitchen knife. What is your tip doing? Where is it in relation? Understand that you want your handle length to be a little bit longer than standard. So remember about 130 to 145 mils. You want the height of the blade around 48 mils to 55 mils. Okay, you want to make sure that you have important clearance. To make your designs look a little bit more aesthetic, you want to make sure you have nice sharp termination points. It just makes it look a little bit more crisp and clear. So I wanted to do this as a form follows function. The story of the Santoku. Probably one of the most popular chef knives we've had in the last 20 to 30 years. How did the Santoku come about? So around the turn of the century, in Japan, it was very cosmopolitan, and they had a lot of European chefs there. And a standard European chef knife is anywhere from 8 inches on the small side up to about 12 inches. They are huge knives. The standard kitchen counter in Japan is only 300 mils. So the knife was longer than the kitchen counter. And what happened is the guys kept snapping the top of their blades off on the back of the counters. And the only way to fix a broken tip, for example, so we have a knife here, we've broken our tip off. It's gone. How do we fix that? We can't re-establish a tip, because what happens if you start grinding up, like that, for example, you're going to be thickening up this extra section here, which doesn't work. Okay? You can't grind a chef knife with a broken tip upwards. You always got to grind downwards. So how did they fix these knives that they were all breaking? Well, the very simple thing is they did that. Some guys obviously do a bit more of a round on there. It really depends on you. But let's look at that one. It looks quite nice. And that's how the Santoku was born. But now the interesting aspect about this, if you actually look at it, all of a sudden, our tip is now sitting below center line. You see how that works? So we've shortened the blade. We've taken away a lot of the belly because the tip's broken off. But all of a sudden, we find ourselves with a beautiful profile for a typical Japanese chef knife. So you always got to remember that you can take a standard design and you can quickly change it to do other things. For example, we're going to take this knife here. We want to do what they call a K-tip. Well, that's pretty straightforward. All we do is take a line there, erase that section there, and once again, we've got a beautiful Japanese knife with the tip below center line. The other thing I wanted to talk about is you don't want there to be a solid, I said it earlier, but I don't want this to be a 90 degree. What I find is if I slightly angle that up, it really just helps the balance and makes the knife flow a little bit better. So hopefully you guys got some ideas, and I explained well enough how I design a chef knife. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to be moving on to abrasives. Abrasives, such a big topic. What I want to do is go through some of my thoughts and theories about abrasives. This is an aspect of knife making which I don't think enough knife makers actually put serious thought into. They get told to use this abrasive, so they jump onto that abrasive, and that's all they use. What I can say is, from my experience over the years, and I've tried so many different types of abrasives from different suppliers to different material compositions, different sizes, different thicknesses. I have gone through so much trial and error working on the abrasives that I've finally settled on. But the one thing I'm going to impress on you, and this is the most important aspect that I think about abrasives, is that no abrasive, and I repeat, no abrasive is worth your time. Bob Loveless always said, use abrasives like they're free, and I do. The time spent on a 50 Rand abrasive is not going to be worth your hour of hand sanding. So what I say is, use abrasives as quickly and as fast as possible. Don't worry about them. Don't try to get the last 3 cents out of your abrasive. All you're going to do is burn your blade and waste your time. So I'm going to emphasize that again. No abrasive is worth your time. Abrasives will always be cheaper. So what do I look for in an abrasive? I've tried different types, different styles, and one thing I've realized is it all comes down to application, application, application. Even though one knife maker swears by a certain brand or a certain style of belt, doesn't mean that belt's going to work for you, okay? I realized that is that when I started working things, the belts that people were telling me were great, they were great for that application that they were using them in, but they weren't great for the application I was using them in. So I've played around and I've looked all over the place and managed to find a handful of great suppliers that help me out. So for the most part, for all our rough grinding and profiling, we're going to use ceramic belts, okay? You have to use ceramic belts. Ceramic belts cut hardened steel better than anything else. For the most part, I use a 36 belt, a 60 grit belt, and a 120 grit belt in ceramics. For the guys who are interested, I use the Sandmite P967S's. Okay, so these are ceramic belts. These are the ones I like to use for my rough grinding and profiling. Okay, I run them in a 25 mil, so they're 1 inch wide because I use a 1 inch platen. I find that I can get better material removal with the slightly thinner belt than trying to wrestle a big 2 inch wide belt. So guys, ceramic bolts are your friend, but what you got to bear in mind is they like pressure and they like speed. So you generally want to run these pretty fast and you want to push hard. Don't be scared. You really want to try lean in with these ceramic bolts to get them to cut. Because what actually happens is that the ceramic crystals might dull over, and once you apply pressure, they break off and they shear and they actually give you more coarse grit. So they actually need to be pushed against to get them to break and to keep them going for longer. The other style of belt I like to use is when we start doing our hand sanding processes and just general finishing of blades. For these, I don't need super expensive abrasives. I use a 50 mil 2 inch wide belt. I use 2 main grits, which is a 220 and a 600. These are aluminium oxides. You can use whatever aluminium oxides you want. The cheapest ones, these are just for final finishes and just to save you. You're going to be finishing it by hand anyway. So I find this is the only time I sort of skimp out on abrasives is my general finishing belts. For hand sanding, handle finishes and stuff like that, is I go for cheap aluminium oxides. But what I do is when I want to start rounding and polishing steel, for example, on my spine of my knife, the inside curve of my handle and things like that, I start going into structured abrasive. So what they mean by a structured abrasive is that it's actually, these aren't a ceramic or aluminium oxide and things like that. They actually got a very weird look to them. These are the 3M Trizac belts. So the other thing to bear in mind when you start looking at Trizac belts and Gator belts, and especially a lot of the 3M products, is that their designations are a lot different to regular sandpaper, where here we got a 60 grit or a P60 or a P120 or a P600. These have a different classification. So here I use 2 main ones. I use an A16, which is 1,000 odd grit, and a A6, which is around a 2,000, 2,500 grit. These belts are great because they last literally forever. I literally use 1 set a year. For polishing steel, polishing bolsters, these things really excel. They do a terrible job of trying to polish wood and things like that. They don't do that well. But if you're just looking to polish steel, I find these abrasives are absolutely phenomenal. Then another one, if I'm doing a large production run, so you'll see in the video when we go into hand sanding, I just used aluminium oxide belts because that's the most easy to come by belts for a lot of knife makers. So you can start that hand sanding process without too much investment in materials. But when I'm doing production runs, and you're looking at your margins and you want to make sure you're making knives cost effectively and things like that, is that I've started using these belts from VSM. They're called the Lumeron belts, otherwise known as mud belts. Another structured abrasive belt. What's crazy about these is that looks super smooth, but that's 180 grit. These belts are designed to be used with a misting system, so a water system, just to help them grind better. So what I find is that what I'll do is instead of hand sanding at 220 to 600, these do take a little bit longer, but I like that water and I like the finish. So I'll just increase a couple increments in there. So I'll go 180 grit, 220 grit, 400 grit, 600 grit. And I'll just jump through those a lot quicker, and I find that process, it might take me 5 minutes longer than using these abrasives, but these last longer, they cut consistently. So I've also, if you're looking for something else, have a look at the VSM Lumeron belts. The next thing I look at when I do abrasives is I use a lot of disc sanders. Okay, so all my knives are made with a disc sander. I can't not make a knife without a disc sander. But what I found, and this is the thing I want to get you guys to understand, is if you don't like a process, change it. Nobody says you have to do it this way. No one. No one's going to come shout at you if you're not paying attention or you're doing something a little bit different. So what I found is that normal sandpaper on a disc sander, it's a pain. You got to cut the discs, the paper ends up sticking, you got to clean them regularly and stuff like that. So I'm very fortunate that my abrasive supplier has a die cutter. So he actually cuts my 230mm discs. And these are actually made out of belt material. So they've got a stiff backing, they're not going to tear, they're not going to rip. The contact adhesive sticks onto them beautifully. They last longer than conventional sort of wet and dry paper that a lot of the guys use on disc sanders. So what I would say is if you're looking to up your disc grinder game, get in touch with me. I'm sure we can hook you up with these guys. I use them in two main grits. I use a 100 and I use a 320. The 100 is just great for rough shaping, refining, getting rid of scale, any sort of bigger scratches that are left over from grinding. And this guy is just a beautiful way to lay down a beautiful foundation finish when you want to start hand sanding and doing your final work and stuff like that. And then lastly, on my other abrasives, you'll see it in the video, is this has been the biggest game changer for me with regards to abrasives in a number of years, is that I've started using these little automotive pads. So these are very commonly used in the panel beating industry, where they are Velcro back, so you can actually stick them onto a Velcro hand sander, but I've developed my own little 150mm disc with a Velcro backing. So I can change these things out literally. It's a rip off, rip on. I use them in three main grits because this is all final foundation polishing. I'll use a 400 grit, an 800 grit, and a 1500 grit. If I'm doing really fancy knives, I'll even take it up to a 4000 grit with these guys. But where these really come to, they're cheap. I find them readily available. Cheap, readily available, and easy to use. So you're not fighting the abrasives. You don't want to be fighting abrasives. You want abrasives that work for your system and make your life easier, because that's what abrasives are there to do, is to make your life easier. So I'll just remind you, no abrasive is worth your time. Use them like they are free. Before we're going to start making knives, I thought what I'll do is I'm just going to run you through my workshop. I've spent 8 years making knives now, and I don't have the biggest equipped workshop by any means, but I've found what works for me. So we're going to go through everything now. So obviously we're going to be starting off with our main bulk grinder. So this is a Herbst Ultimate grinder. You can use a regular 3-wheel grinder, whatever grinder you have, as long as it's a decent powered machine. So this one is a 1.5 kilowatt, 2 horsepower, 3-phase motor on this machine. So it's quite a beast. I found normal sort of 0.75 kilowatt machines, I've burnt those out. I store the motors on those. So you need to at least a 1.5. You could probably get away with a 1.1, but 1.5, 2 horsepower is your minimum. In South Africa, we run 2-meter long belts. So in the United States, you guys use a 2x72 grinder, 72 inches being the length, which I think is about 180 odd centimeters. So in South Africa, our belts are a little bit longer. The main difference that I do when I approach my chef knives is I use a 1-inch 25mm bolt for most of my actual grinding. So you'll actually notice that my flat pattern actually runs with a 25mm belt. Very simple. Modern day ceramics really do prefer pressure and speed. So if I've got a lesser surface area to grind with, that means I actually increase the pressure. So it's way more effective in grinding off blades. You don't have to, but I like to use a 25mm bolt when I'm doing all my rough platens and stuff like that. So this machine obviously gets fitted with a platen, then I also have a 300mm wheel that attaches to it as well. So that's my main preliminary grinder. Obviously it's variable speed. So we can slow it down, speed it up, forward and reverse. There we go, forwards and reverse. Right, bear in mind, I've only had this grinder for less than a year. For the first 7 years of my career, this was my main grinder. So the only grinder I had. I managed to find it secondhand for a bargain, but I had to put a lot of new components into it. I had to put new motors, new contact wheels. I pretty much bought a frame. So the main thing behind this one is this is where my power hand sanding starts. You'll notice, you'll see when you get to it in the video. But what I've developed, or I wouldn't say I've developed, I've just expanded on a long-standing method of hand sanding, where I saw this first method in Francois Massain's workshop, and he learned it from mastersmith Kevin Harvey, where they used to do a 150 mil wheel, and they used to put camping mattress foam on it, just to give it a bit of cushioning. So what I've done is I found the camping mattress foam just a little bit too on the soft side. So I've actually taken an old Scotch-Brite conditioning belt. I've wrapped it around the serrated belt with quite a few layers of industrial strength masking tape. It's not the most safest of methods, but I've never had any issues with it. I've had this wheel for 5 years. I've been using this method. I've never had any issues with it. So this is a quick shop, homemade, doesn't run the truest, but it works really well for the application we're doing. So, but we'll see that when we get to the video. So pretty much, it's just got a bit of cushioning. You want a wheel that's got nice softness to it. I found that the 150 mil diameter was a little bit too narrow, and you would end up getting rivets if you weren't careful. So I went for a slightly bigger one. This is about a 240 mil. I do have plans for a 300 mil with the same sort of configuration to just speed up the process and get it a little bit more accuracy and things like that. So this is also a 1.5 kilowatt motor, 3-phase variable speed. I also have a water attachment onto this. So this is a mister I got from Z's Knife Supplies. This is really great. Hooks up to the compressor. It's got a feed at the bottom there. So that we're running with that, and we can got variable water control. And we can also vary the flow of air. This is really indispensable when we start our power hand sanding to keep the blade as cool as possible. You've got to remember, we do not want to get that blade hotter than our tempering temperatures. And we temper pretty low on these steels. We're only tempering to about 150 degrees, where most knives you sort of do to 200. So I do 150 degrees. So your margin for heating up that blade is just so much more smaller. So I really recommend you look at a water misting system or a dripper. It just really helps to keep the blades really nice and cool while you're grinding and getting all your scratches out. Without a doubt, I could not make a knife without this piece of kit. Obviously your bolt grinder is your number one have to have. My second have to have is a disc sander. Disc grinders are indispensable in making chef knives, from flattening large profiles of blades, profiling. I really cannot make a knife without this guy. So this one is, I built this one myself. Had the parts laser cut. I did order in the disc, but we had that machined. So this is a 0.75 kilowatt 3-phase motor as well. I like to have variable speed on this. You can get away with a 0.55, but I really do use this guy a lot, so I went a bit bigger. So it's a single horsepower 0.75 kilowatt motor. It runs a 230 mil disc. What I do is, from my abrasive supplier, I get my discs pre-cut to fit here. These discs are actually made out of the same backing material as your grinding belts. So they're nice and strong. The problem with the paper ones is the glue tends to stick quite a bit, and you spend a lot of time cleaning and stuff like that. So I just found going over to these material backing abrasives really have been a life changer for me. Obviously with these you just use a pressure sensitive spray on glue. Then for cleaning it, I find a general purpose adhesive cleaner works really well. Just to get the glue off here every now and then, once or twice a week, I'll just give this thing a good clean, just so I don't have any bumps or irregularities when I'm doing all my grinding and everything like that. The other very critical thing is you want to make sure that this is 90 degrees. We spent a lot of time trying to make sure this is absolutely 90. So that's the disc sander, one of the most critical pieces of equipment if you're going to be making chef knives. Right, so this piece of kit here is a mini wheel attachment, a mini wheel machine. To be honest, this is a nice to have. I've also had this machine for less than a year. So for the most part, for the first 7 years of my knife making, I used a sort of standard mini wheel attachment that fits onto my main grinder. But when you're trying to do production, trying to do this as a living, constantly changing attachments is a real pain in the butt, and it steals time from you. So it's always nice to have standalone machines for certain applications. So we have a mini wheel here. So this one pretty much runs a 2-meter belt. I do use a 50 mil wide belt. Then obviously what you can do is you get different wheel diameters that go onto it. Like so. So really nice piece of kit, but not a have to have, but it really is a nice to have. So once again, obviously you see it's a 3-phase. I like to have all my machines on variable speed for the sheer fact is when you're going to finer grits, you really want to slow your machine down. It's the one serious advantage of having variable speed. But for most of the applications that we do when we grind our chef knives, you can actually do it on a single speed machine if you've got a water dripper, that to keep your blades cool on the hand sanding side. But the main bevel grinding at 36 grit, 60 grit and 120 grit, you can sort of pretty much do it at high speed. Sometimes I do like to change it down on the 120 grit to slow it down. But for the most part, you can get away with grinding on a single speed machine, but I highly recommend you save up, spend the extra money on a variable speed drive, and get variable speed on your machines. Right, so next piece of equipment is the drill press. Obviously, I've got a few drill presses in my workshop, all set up for a different purpose. But for most guys, you can get away with a single drill press. So I have 2 sizes at the moment. So for this, I run all my drill bits up to about a 5mm. Then the bigger one over here, we're going to use for 8mm, and slightly bigger ones also runs at a slightly slower speed. I've got a built-in stop there to stop blades from swinging around. But these are pretty stock standard. One thing I do like is keyless chucks. It just really helps on saving time, changing, looking for chuck keys and things like that. So I've just upgraded mine to keyless chucks, which has made a huge improvement. So drill presses, definitely a must-have. So the next piece of equipment is a bandsaw. I would recommend, if you're going to choose a bandsaw, I would look at a wood-cutting bandsaw first. I see so many guys battling with prepping of handle materials, especially if you're dealing with expensive bills and things like that. You definitely want to have a bandsaw that can do the job properly. So I've got a decent wood-cutting bandsaw here. It's from the 1950s, so it's really old. I love this thing to bits. I've also got it wired up to a 3-phase motor, so I do have variable speed on it, but I don't do a lot of metal cutting. For the main reason I have this bandsaw is just to prep my handle materials. So the biggest improvement I've made in my handle finishing is investing in this 150mm disc that I had custom built. So pretty much what it is, it runs 150mm Velcro back discs. So the biggest advice I can give to guys, if you're going to be getting into abrasives, is try to find industry standards. So these belts, these pads are actually used in the automotive industry exclusively. They are pretty available from the major abrasive suppliers, come in a variety of discs. So I use a 400, 800 and a 1500. I've seen pads go all the way up to 6,000. So all they are is Velcro backed, 150mm disc. Okay, so I've got this on a 3-phase machine, like all my other machines. Okay, so I had this custom built, but I know what you're saying, Dave, I can't afford that, I can't get that. So this is the one I first made myself. This is actually the second one I made myself. The first one also burnt out. What I did is, if you go to major hardware stores, you'll actually find a 150mm padded disc that they use for automotive body, but it's got a foam backing on it. So all I did is I took that plastic housing, I cut off the foam, I stuck Velcro onto it, and this thing's actually epoxied, excuse my hack mechanics, but with this buffer I had, the threads didn't match, so I just glued it on there. And I made hundreds of knives on this car. Single speed, but it uses those pads. I promise you, if you get into these pads, it'll absolutely change the way you look at handle finishing and how you can finish your blades. You will take so much time off of it. It's nice and stiff, you don't wash out anything, and you get those super fine grits on a machine, so you don't have to do it by hand. So these are an absolute game changer if you're looking to finish up your handles. The next piece of advice I want to chat to you guys about is body positioning and how we work and how we stand while we're actually working on our knives. I see so many guys when they're doing, especially hand sanding, they crunched over their vise, bent over, back hunched over. I promise you, if you're going to do this all day full time, your body will not survive that kind of thing. You can speak to a lot of knife guys, it wreaks havoc on the shoulders. So what I've done is I've made improvements throughout my workshop to try to help improve my body positioning, especially when I'm doing work on handwork. So we're shaping bolsters, shaping the insides of handles, doing hand sanding, things like that. Is that my knife vise, so I had a good friend of mine, Kevin, make this for me. It's pretty straightforward, it's just some tubing that we put together with some boxes. So I like a nice wide vise. The reason I prefer this vise is so that I can turn it around in those orientations when I need to work. But what's really important is you can actually see the height of it. It actually sits very high up for me. All right, so I'm not hunched over trying to look at my work. I can actually sit straight up, shoulders back, and I can actually do my work like that. So try get your work high up when you're doing work like this. Otherwise your back's gonna kill you, your shoulders are gonna be sore. This type of setup with the correct body positioning will make knife making so much easier. The other very critical thing is lighting. All right, so what I have is I use what they call guide lights, available from SD Knives, Stefan Deirdrichs. It's an articulated light with a nice strong LED. So I can move it around, it's articulated and mounted to the wall, up there. Having that variable light so you can move it and get it in the position you really want. And the other thing is, because it's sometimes nice to have light from the back of you, but then your head casts a shadow and things like that. But if you actually have the light in front of you, you see better. You're not dealing with the light shining in your eyes, giving you glare and stuff like that. So you can really work your part much better with better view and things like that. The other thing I like to have is a rotary tool. So your standard, what people call a Fordham, so mine's actually a Baron. So these are foot pedal jewelry used exclusively in the jewelry industry. It's like a mini drill. You can use the cheaper ones, the Dremels and things like that. I'm a full-time knife maker, so I need to have slightly better equipment. So I have a full-on industrial one. But to be honest, these things are really reasonably priced and they'll make an absolute game-changing experience once you learn how to use them, especially with the right setup, that you're not killing yourself, you're not bent over. The other very critical aspect of knife making is your PPE, so personal protection equipment. First things first, respirator. You have to work with a respirator. I don't care what anybody says, no one will change my mind. 3M respirators are the best. They're available everywhere. You can get various cartridge configurations and things like that. They are super comfortable, which makes it a lot easier to wear. You don't want to wear a mask that's uncomfortable, because then you're not going to wear it and then you're going to end up getting all kinds of stuff in your lungs and things like that. So a decent pair of respirators, so I recommend the 3M version. Safety glasses as well. And you're talking to a guy who's got super glue in his eye, I pulled splinters out of my eye, so I'm very pedantic now. I always try to wear my safety glasses whenever I'm in the workshop. You don't want to lose these members. These are the most important tool when it comes to knife making, because if you can't see what you're doing. So never forget to wear your safety glasses. Right, now we're going to move over to the grinder. I'm just going to talk about body positioning at the grinder as well. So one thing is when you're hand sanding, remember, keep your shoulders back, tucked back, stand up straight, don't hunch over. It really puts a wreck on your back and your shoulders. Right, the very next important body positioning is when you're actually standing at our main grinder. You got to remember, you want to give yourself the best base you possibly can. You want to be steady. So feet you want shoulder width apart. You want to tuck those elbows in. Okay, you actually want to almost rest them on your hip bones like that. So you're holding those knives like that, because if you're holding it out like that, the grinder's just going to tend to pull it down. So you actually want to tucken up, all right? And you're not really moving your hands. It's all in the hips. But what I say, the important part is to try to look at the shoulders. Try to keep those tucked back. Okay, stand up straight, because if you end up slouching, it pulls on your muscles here, you end up getting pains and shooting pains. I know some guys that actually grind with one of those sleeping pillows that the guys use on a plane, just to take the weight off their neck from hanging down like that. You've got to remember, as soon as you start tilting that head forward, it gets very heavy and it can really stress you out. So shoulders back, down, locked, engaged. You want to use your organic grounding rest, as I call it. All right, so we've got our hands nicely tucked up there, and then we're going to move like that. Okay. We're going to go the other side. And what you find, especially if you're grinding a longer blade, the easiest thing is as well, you can actually just choke up on the blade, make it a smaller knife, as they say, and you can grind like that. Okay, but just remember, shoulders back, stomach engaged, tuck those hands nice and close, give yourself control. You don't want that knife to get away from you. You want to make sure it's rested. So I like to rest it on my fingers like that. And one other thing, once again, the guide light comes in very useful if I'm looking for direct light right on the workpiece. So I can see exactly what I'm doing. Plus I've got an overhead hanging light as well, which I can adjust to make sure my lighting is absolutely perfect. Lighting will improve your work. If you can see what you're doing, you're going to make less mistakes. All right. So remember, arms in, tucked, close to the side, and that's how we're going to be grinding. Okay. So now on to everybody's least favorite piece of equipment, the buffer. Most people you speak to who work in a mechanical shop will tell you a buffer is one of the most dangerous machines in the workshop. You're dealing with fast rotating cloth wheels that love to grab blades and throw them. There's been a few knife makers that actually lost their lives to buffers. I think the last one was about 4 or 5 years ago. A guy had a buoy right through his chest. So you've got to be super careful with buffers. I cannot emphasize this enough. Be super careful with buffers. So this buffer I also got from Herbst, 0.75 kilowatt single speed. So I don't need variable speed on a buffer. You just want it to turn. I run 2 main different types of wheels. I run a solid stitch wheel. So that's for my initial cutting. Okay, so I'll use a different cut. So generally I'll use like a step 4 sort of cut or polish. If the scratches are really bad, I'll go down to a step 2. With my final finish being a step 5, okay. But generally the heavier cutting polishes I use on the closed stitched wheel like that. The green super finish I use on a loose leaf. This is the one that really likes to grab blades. The nice thing with this machine is you just pop the wheels on, and as you turn it on, those screws actually tighten the wheels onto there. You want to keep these things clean. What happens a lot of the time is sometimes you'll get shavings, chips from your grinder, from the angle grinder, can actually get embedded in those things, and it actually forms like a little steel splinter that scratches your blade. So it's always good to just keep these things nice and clean. I just got a piece of wood with some nails run through it. And it's also very important always the most important thing with buffers is that you don't want to be pressing hard on a buffer by any means. If you're deflecting that buffer more than 10 mils, you're buffing too hard. What actually does the polishing is the compound that's on there. Very little actually has to do with the actual mop itself. The real power is in the compound. So use the compound. Apply regularly, push softly, don't press hard when you're going into a buffer. Also, you always want to work below the center line. You don't want to be buffing too high up, because what happens is that blade catches, it's going to throw it into yourself. If you work lower down, what happens if it grabs enough, it's generally just going to throw it away from you, so you're not going to get into too much trouble with that. But when you're working on a buffer, please be mindful, please be focused. These things will absolutely wreck you. Right, now that we've covered how to design a chef knife, what abrasives we're going to be using, how we're going to be standing and working in our workshop, now we're actually going to start making the knife. So we're going to start off with transferring our template onto a piece of steel and heat treat.